So today we're going to be exploring difficulties with defining goodness. But I think I can go out on a limb and say at the beginning it's very, very good. Certainly very good to be able to welcome so many of you here today, particularly our visitors who've travelled quite far and given generously of their time to help in organising this and to lead sessions for us for what will be quite a packed day, hopefully, for all of us. I'll keep it brief, because I know you're much keener to hear from Professor more than you are from me. You see far too much of me already. So I'll just keep it very brief. Title of our conference is Good God, Exploring the Intersection Between Religion and Morality. This has been kept deliberately vague because it will allow us to hopefully give us the latitude to raise as many questions as we can and just see where the discussions and the papers take us, which is why the afternoon will be a much more interactive session where we'll have panel discussions and breakout workshops, so you'll get much closer discussions. But we will be considering questions like how might belief in God influence or inform people's moral values? Do we need to believe in God to have a strong moral code, for example? Perhaps we are better off finding non-religious grounds, more naturalistic grounds for our morality. It's hoped that the day will inspire those of you who already do philosophy or religious studies, which incorporates a large part of philosophy and ethics, to want to think more deeply and more precisely about these matters. But it's also hoped there's many of you joining us outside of those A-levels, and it's hoped that this will inspire you to want to continue to explore philosophical questions beyond the conference. There is a slight change in schedule. You've got an outline of the day there. Obviously, we're slightly late starting. So we have two papers in the morning, by Professor Moore and Dr. Webster, and then those interactive sessions in the afternoon. I just want to say very, very briefly, I don't want to take up time from our speakers, but I just want to introduce the themes of the day, really, by asking us to consider. I'm going to raise one type of question for us. Should the idea of God play a part in our moral system, in our moral values? Or is a credible morality one that does not refer to anything beyond this world, anything outside of human relationships or the natural world? So should God play a role? Well, there are a range of roles God might play in our moral values. In Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the concept of God encapsulates the idea that the absolute is one with goodness. God's attributes include moral characteristics. Many of us will know these: omnibenevolence, having an entirely good will, being all good. This might also include justice, love, forgiveness, mercy, and so on. And the reason it's held that God is worthy of worship is not simply because God is all-powerful or absolute, but because of these moral qualities, because God is that which is holy, pure, or set apart. Again, what part might God play in morality? God might be the source of moral value itself. Aquinas holds the view that God's nature, God's goodness, God's good nature is expressed in creation. So just as fire, which is both a source of heat and is heat in itself, is the maximum of heat and is the source of heat, so God similarly is maximally good in God's self and is the source of goodness in creation. To put this maybe more simply, we might hold the view that God's commands determine what is right or wrong. God's commands establish our moral duties. God might also play the part of a moral judge that in some way motivates moral action, motivates our moral conduct, perhaps by ensuring justice, rewarding and punishing in an afterlife. This has led some philosophers. In the breakout sessions, you'll have the opportunity to discuss two of these, William Lane Craig and Ramsey, to develop forms of divine command ethics, which some of you will be familiar with. Divine command ethics basically takes the view that God's commands determine what is morally right and wrong. As Craig puts it, X is good if and only if X is commanded by God. So God's commands determine the moral principles that we ought to follow. And both Ramsey and Craig are keen to argue that any atheistic worldview lacks a credible basis for a secure moral code. Without God, there can be no secure moral values for people. Craig makes this argument on the basis of a rejection of naturalism, which some of you will be aware of, naturalism in ethics. Craig argues that nature is red in tooth and claw. He gives terrible examples of violence that occurs in the natural world and says we could never derive moral values from such a violent world. He's able to draw on things that some of the philosophers in the room will be familiar with, like More's open question argument. More points out that if we are told some action has a natural property, such as an action causes pleasure or produces happiness, it's still an open question we can still meaningfully ask, but is that action good? So goodness or badness is still an open question about an action, even if we know all the natural facts about that action. And this shows, More thinks, and Craig draws on this argument, that the property of goodness is analytically distinct. It's different from any natural property. So we cannot derive our moral maxims from the natural world. Craig can also draw on other anti-realist arguments. I won't go into these. Some of the philosophers will be familiar with these, and you'll get a chance in the afternoon to discuss these. But yeah, we won't talk about these. But yeah, they basically argue, as some of you will be aware, Mackey, following Hume, argues that we cannot find moral properties anywhere in the natural world. So we have to look. They use this to argue for anti-realism, that moral properties do not exist in any objective sense. They do not exist mind independently. But Craig and Ramsey use these kinds of arguments to try to establish their position that moral values can only be derived from a non-natural source. We can't find moral properties in nature. We have to look beyond the natural world to find them. So as William Lane Craig puts it, unless we are nihilists, we have to recognize some ultimate standard of value, and God seems to be the least arbitrary stopping point. Ramsey puts it much more strongly. You might be troubled, some of you, by this, as we'll see. Ramsey says that without belief that our neighbour is an immortal soul made for his life with God, and not merely for his life with us, then nothing is left in our estimate of him to prevent our taking his life whenever some worldly reason seems to demand that we do so. So without God, the value of life itself is lost. We have no reason to accept prohibitions against murder and violence if God does not play a part in our morality. But that may trouble you. The idea that we have no reason not to kill our neighbour if there is no God is quite a morally troubling view. Some of you will be familiar with some of Richard Dawkins' writings. Professor Moore will be dealing with some of these later on as well. Richard Dawkins, this is a somewhat randomly selected list of claims in the Jewish and Christian scriptures. These record, according to those scriptures, God's commands. These are directly from God, according to the scriptures. For example, the execution of people for committing homosexual acts. They have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. There are commands of genocide against particular groups. There's perhaps not an advocacy, but at least some of these claims are complicit in slavery. Slaves are told to be submissive to their masters in the New Testament. And there is the death sentence for blasphemy. So these are just some of the examples of troubling commands that are issued in the Jewish and Christian scriptures. Now, we may excuse these. Perhaps we might think these are just a result of an ancient context where things are different. But the problem with this approach is that these are founded in the eternal decrees of God. So it's very difficult for a liberal to be able to escape by reinterpreting these as contextual or situational. These are timeless, eternal decrees as far as they're presented in those scriptures. So we may actually have, as well as these concerning particular commands, we may have more substantial worries about the role of God in morality. One concern we might have is that if God is the source of moral values, we are not free to develop moral principles and values that are appropriate and relative to our situation. Yeah? Rather, we must adhere to what may be seen as an imposed and arbitrary set of rules that come from outside of us. In his earlier writings, he may have changed his mind later on, but in his earlier writings, Jürgen Habermas, for example, argues that because religious principles are founded in divine commands, they're not open to argument and debate or evidence. Society, he says, depends on our ability to arrive at an informed consensus through debate. If we want to know, for example, whether we ought to allow same-sex marriage, for example, we can look at the evidence, debate what is best within our society, and arrive at a consensus on what is moral and what is acceptable. But from a religious perspective grounded in the idea that God has revealed the answer once and for all in an ancient text, there can be no weighing up of evidence for what is most beneficial for people in society, Habermas says. So there can be no debate arriving at consensus if we rely on religious morality. We ought to exclude it, in fact, he argues in his earlier works. We might also, and this is an argument that is developed by Hume, you'll have a chance to discuss this in the workshops this afternoon. Hume argues that morality concerns our relationships in this world, our place in the natural world alongside each other, particularly our feelings for each other. So placing the aim of morality outside of our relationships and our natural world, he argues, either undermines our moral motivation, we lose any moral incentive, because we're aiming beyond where it has its natural fulfillment, our morality, or where it does provide any moral motivation, he argues, it incentivizes a disregard for people and the environment in which we live. It's no surprise that the environmental policy during the Reagan era in the 80s, Reagan was recorded as having said, we don't have to protect the environment. It was his environment secretary said, we don't have to protect the environment. The second coming of Jesus is at hand. So Hume would not be surprised by this disregard for the environment and for our society and our relationships with one another, as he puts it. Steadily and exclusively attending to something as important to oneself as eternal salvation, where that's my goal through my moral action, is apt to extinguish one's benevolent feelings and to generate a narrow, contracted selfishness. There are further problems. I'll move on. You'll get the chance, some of you will be familiar with the Euthyphro dilemma, which we'll discuss this afternoon in the workshops. So we've heard two sides. Do we need God as the basis for a sound objective morality, without which we have only nihilism, no reason to value life, no reason to value anything in our world? Or ought we to reject any place for God in our moral system, because this distorts what should be our moral duties and actually devalues life? Or perhaps over the day you will come to develop a position of your own on this. Thank you. Thank you very much.